Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Not the first time. This has happened before. We've been here before. So we're asking why? Not the first time. The podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Not the First Time. This is a show where I, Rhett, sit down with Andrew and Cameron and try to figure out what the hell is actually going on in the world. The premise is simple. I bring questions that normal people are hopefully thinking. They bring history and the political context. Together, we try to make sense of how we got here because none of us are experts. We're just three dudes, and we believe that understanding the past is the only way to stop being surprised by the present. And we believe if you can understand how we got here, you can form your own opinion instead of just reacting to headlines. We're going to get into the main card here soon, but before we do, another week or so has passed since we last recorded, boys. What's on your minds?
A whole lot of black gold. Just crude oil has been flowing through my brain. So much to the point that I think we run the risk of just becoming an oil podcast at this point. There's just there's just so much to go through. We might just go full-time oil.
I mean, it's up and down, changing every single day. It is now flooding the headlines. So I do want to say we were pretty prompt in this topic and getting on top of it when we did.
Yeah, who could have seen it coming that invading Iran with no exit strategy would have affected the oil markets? Crazy. It's wild that we got here. It's sad I haven't seen you boys in a couple of weeks because, again, the news is faster than anyone can keep up with. It's the flooding the zone theory of just like madness constantly. But oil is very topical right now. So nice work, boys. We picked a good one.
Yeah. Oil's topical. I think we'd be remiss not to mention what just happened at the correspondence dinner. I don't know if we got any hot thoughts on that or if that's just a topic we don't even want to get into or touch. You guys tell me.
I'm going to take your cue here.
I just think it's certainly a sign of just the chaos. Well, actually, you know what? We're going to be talking a lot about the 70s today, and I feel like in the 70s there was a very same sort of mentality of there's no more heroes anymore and everything's fucked and there's just no hope. And I feel like this is a sign of that. I feel like people are fed up and sick and we don't condone violence of any form here. Violence always begets more violence, and again, I just think it's if you make flood a populace with a bunch of guns, with information and bullshit, and a government that doesn't have our best interest in mind, like things ignite, and that's what we saw.
Weird combination for those things to happen, right?
The weirdest thing for me is that the rallying cry afterwards was to get a ballroom. To somehow that would have protected the correspondence dinner. Like all these influencers coming out talking about the ballroom is incredible. I was like, damn, it would have taken me years to land at a ballroom after that. But God bless him.
Again, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? He immediately just thought, how does this benefit me? Immediately after that. And it was the ballroom. He was trying to get his construction deal in place. So I think it just points to classic Trump, just again trying to turn this into something that can benefit him.
Yeah, and the video that he tweeted out, it's like, buddy, if you're going to do an assassination attempt, running through like a hotel lobby past every Secret Service agent I can possibly imagine, what horrible. Like, you're a fucking idiot. I'm shocked
he wasn't
going to
get far.
Yeah.
I know.
Who was the last president that was assassinated at that same hotel?
Oh, what? I don't even know which hotel. I guess
shot or like actually killed.
I thought when I was
I thought Reagan. I know
Reagan.
Reagan was shot there.
Oh, was there an attempt on Reagan there?
Yep.
Okay.
Ikis, what was the guy's name?
Oh, Sirhan.
Nope, that was
right?
RFK. I forget what his name was. I was hoping you'd be able to pull it out.
Oh, God.
It's like John. No, hold on.
Hey, guys, I can pull up additional tabs now. We're in business.
John Warnock Hinckley Jr.
Turns out Podcasting on old computers, not great. So again, sorry for the delay, everyone.
What was the guy's name?
John Warnick Hinckley Jr. So following suit, we're like, if you kill a president, you got to have 3 names for some reason. It's just how it works out.
Yeah.
I wonder if they go by the 3 names before they shoot the president, or is that something that we just like do? We're like, oh, we're going to add the middle name because fuck it.
We dub them with the middle name now.
It's got to be an old-timey thing, right?
Well, there's probably other John Booths in the world. So they're like, well, if we call him John Wilkes Booth, like you get all the other John Booths
Then there's
off
no
your
confusion.
back. Like, yeah, you don't immediately think of it. And unfortunately, in this country, we have enough examples of it. God damn. Except for Sirhan Sirhan, but that guy just had the first name twice.
Yeah.
What year was, you guys said Reagan, right? What year was the attempt?
1981.
81. Okay.
So he hadn't even been a bad president yet. Like, he was just 1 year in. It's like, buddy, at least wait until you see the war on drugs.
Have a few data points to point to before
Yeah,
you
fucking
before you
A,
act like
dude.
that.
Well, maybe they were all fed up with all of the oil shit that went down in the 70s that we're gonna somehow tie into this and get into it today.
Well, John
it could be
Hinckley was,
possible.
wait, really quickly. John Hinckley was the Jodie Foster guy. That's how crazy that our assassins get, is that he wanted to impress a notorious lesbian, that he was like the ultimate male. And she's like, buddy, what are we doing here? So sorry, you go ahead. I just forgot that he was the Jodie Foster one, which is incredible.
Was that part of his like manifesto?
Oh yeah, dude.
To,
He did it to try to impress, because Jodie Foster has been very outspoken her entire life. She's very politically active, to say the least. And during the 80s, she was very against Reagan and kind of the war machines that was the United States at the time. And his idea to impress her was to shoot Ronald Reagan. And again, to like, I think he was like madly in love with her. And Jodie Foster, again, she was out back then. So it's like, buddy, wild.
Yeah. Everyone knows that's how you get a lesbian to fall in love with you, is toxic male
Reagan.
violence.
toxic masculinity.
Yeah,
It's a
that'll do
thing
the trick.
then. It's a thing now.
He mansplained an assassination.
Yeah, gets him every time. Well, I'm sure Jodie had some grievances of probably what went on in the 70s, I would guess, if she was an outspoken character of political things. So
Fuck yeah, she did.
let's tie it in. Let's tie it into today. So we're getting back into oil, and we're hitting on part 2 today. Last time in part 1, Cameron did an awesome deep dive of how oil became the single most important thing in the world. And in this period of time we're diving into today, it really starts to, from my understanding, get into a lot of changes on like what becomes of that power, because it's no longer who just has oil. It's about like who controls it, who gets to use it as leverage. And I think the 70s, we really start to see that leverage turn into a weapon. And once that happens, it seems like things kind of start to change. So Andrew, I hope I teed you up okay there. You want to pick us up where we left off?
That was the perfect segue, because like last where Cameron left off, we had just talked about OPEC getting up and running. In a last episode, Rhett, you asked about what does nationalizing oil really mean? And like, what does it mean when these companies are getting mixed into the fold? Like you said, who does have the real power of oil? And that question becomes the central question of the rest of the 20th century. And that's because it's not who has final ownership of the oil, it's who has ownership of the profits of the oil. Like it does come down to who's getting the money. Is it the countries producing the oil, or is it the companies selling the oil? Because both need each other. The countries have the resource itself and they extract it, they refine it. But the oil companies have all of those, bells and whistles of a corporate structure that make it viable. They have access to the markets, they have logistics and networks to move those products, get those products into consumers' hands. And in a lot of regards, like what Cameron said last episode, since these oil companies have been in business for so long, a lot of ways they have, better ways to extract and refine that oil. Like they know how to be efficient with it, but each wants majority control And this becomes really messy because you have disgustingly profitable capitalistic companies that are now becoming business partners with nation states, many of them run by dictators in a sensitive region of the world that's always on the brink of war, and you get into the giant mess that we've had.
What could possibly go wrong adding capitalism to countries' only natural resources? I
Nothing.
can't
It's the
possibly
dream.
see a way that going wrong in the next
Is
hour
that
we
is
talk
that the
about this.
definition of the American dream right there?
It is. Karl Marx really missed the boat, like he didn't foresee this in any way. And you have to remember that, before OPEC became a thing, Western oil companies went around and brokered these deals with oil countries, essentially like weaseling their way in to ensure that they were getting the most profit out of this. And the oil countries were getting fleeced. Like, honestly, I mean, these oil companies wanted to restrict the production of oil. It was a supply demand thing. And by restricting that production of oil, they wanted to charge higher prices. But if you're one of these oil countries, your number one export and your major revenue stream, all of your eggs are in the oil basket. And so any drop in oil production means a drop in revenue, which is not good. And that's why OPEC became a thing in the first place. It was to ensure, coordinated oil production, control prices, really to keep these Western oil companies in check. Because again, it's all one big game on who gets most of the oil money. And so OPEC was there to ensure that these Arab, Middle Eastern, Gulf regions were getting most of that money. But just because you establish, an international organization to make money that way doesn't mean that you will. And they didn't. Like, OPEC was a chaotic mess when it first launched. They lacked experience for the most part. Like everything that, Cameron had talked about last episode, we're talking about World War I, and then even beyond, like from the British and French Empire to then the U.S. coming in. They had never really had full control of their own oil. There was always Western companies involved. And so they really lacked the technical skill and the business acumen to really know what to do with all this oil once they started brokering these deals. And so by the 60s, these oil producing countries, the Seven Sisters, again, that Cameron had talked about, they still had that 50% control. And OPEC faced coordination problems because they never really worked well with each other, because if one OPEC member was demanding too much from these oil companies, the oil company would just lower production in that country and then ramp it up in another one. So they were unable to coordinate because one country would always be desperate for cash. Like one of these Gulf regions would always be willing to ramp up production in its country to get that cash, without any regard for what it was going to do to affect any of the other members.
Totally.
So,
and I think looking at where they were at this time, it's hard to blame them for trying to do the first thing ever to separate the Western powers from their lands. Like, although as you mentioned, the operation of it and the rollout had left a lot to be desired, you got to look at through like a historical lens. This was really the first time since the British Empire had made its way through the Middle East that you actually saw some sort of organized rebellion amongst different countries. Because another thing which we see today is this area is there's so much tension between different groups and different countries. I mean, different religions. I mean, the same religion with different sects. It just keeps going and going. So it's a major moment for OPEC that they actually did come together. Although the rollout sucked, it was really the first time that we saw a coordinated effort between multiple different countries and people to try and fight back against the West.
It was, yeah. And again, I don't want to put the cart too much in front of the horse, but it does end up bearing fruit. It's just like that launch off period was really messy for all of those centuries of colonial power that had the control. They finally had the keys and they didn't know what to do with it. So it was a rough launch when they were getting up and running.
So just to ground us here, OPEC stands for what, and who were the members of OPEC, and where does that intersection lie with the Seven Sisters that we were talking about last time? Draw those comparisons for me there, please.
Yeah, so OPEC is the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. And then it originally started with 5 countries, I believe: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, and Iran, maybe. But it originally started with 5 that came together for this.
And those 5 were essentially like, hey, I mean, last time I was asking about the nationalization of oil, they were like, hey, we've had enough of people coming in and taking our our oil and making profit off it. We are going to make a coalition and we're going to kick them out. That was the goal of OPEC.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to realize this isn't something that every country can do. And that's the unique power of oil, is that not every country on earth can actually produce it. In fact, only very few countries on earth can produce it in the scale that actually affects them economically. So it's just this whole topic is on a subject that's just a unique card in the game of historical pawns. It's one of those things that not everyone can do. They recognize that, and they also saw a world that was rapidly changing to, doesn't matter if you can produce it, everyone was using it.
So would you guys look at OPEC as like a government, or the governments of the countries involved in it, seeing this as like, hey, we are forming like a security alliance amongst each others to help protect each other?
That's the idea, I think. Generally, it's protecting, self-centeredly, I'm sure it was protecting their own assets first and foremost, but you aren't able to do that as a solo country. So you add 4 other countries to the mix that control so much of the market that's when your thumb actually does weigh the scale. And I think this is just the first time that was ever actually used.
Yeah, and it really is like the EU, right? It very much is an economic alliance, right? Like militarily, it gets really dicey. And it's not really like a defense or a military. It's so that they can like strengthen numbers, right? And this is where that is sort of like Middle East versus the West really ramps up, because now you have these official coalitions that are trying to vie with each other economically. And so again, the idea for them was to coordinate production, talk about who's setting what prices, so that again, like a rising tide will lift all boats. But again, it sounds great in theory, but one country is just always going to want that cash more than the other. And and again, they're run by dictators who have their own self-interest in mind. And so it didn't always go as they had written it out. So it's a complicated mess, OPEC, and it always has been. But meanwhile, at this time in the 70s, across the Atlantic in the United States, things were also getting very messy, because by the late 60s and early 70s, the U.S. was producing a ton of oil, and they doubled oil production in 1950 and 1960, and almost doubled that production, and that was entirely driven by rigs in Texas. But we were running out of surplus oil capacity once we got into the 70s. Before this, we had a huge reserve. Again, Texas we were one of the top oil producing nations because of Texas. And that was the kind of oil that's in the Middle East, where it's sitting in big pools underground. So you got to set up the rig and you could just suck it out. And we had one of the biggest reserves in the world, but we were blowing through it. I mean, our production of oil was now on a steady decline. And it's a stark reminder that oil is not a renewable energy. Once you run out, you run out. And that's what started to happen in the early 70s, because our oil production peaked at 100% in the early 70s. Like our rigs in Texas, Oklahoma, and Dakotas, they were making as much as they could, but it was not able to keep pace with the amount of rapid economic expansion that we were seeing. Because we were building, this is when we build the boomer utopia society, the post-war. Like we have, for the first time, we are ramping up factories and infrastructure. I mean, all of this just requires a massive amount of oil, and we couldn't keep up. And so this is when we had to rely, for the first time, this is when we had to heavily rely on foreign oil, and we started to import that from where else but the Middle East.
I think it's important that, historically speaking, where we are, like the world that we all live in, the United States that we've grown up in, is a very different world than we saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but especially before the World Wars. The United States, I think, was 19th in economic power before World War I. And by the time World War II had ended, we were number 1. We were doing all of the war debts, all of the loans, everything was being run by the United States. And what we saw after that is a country that tried to live up to this aura that we had built through those 2 wars. So we started building so much in the infrastructure and the highway systems and the cars, and like the whole American dream was really an idea after World War II. That's when you get the white picket fences, the wife that stays at home, the car in the driveway. Like that whole image comes to life right before this. And in order to match the campaign, we basically built our infrastructure based on that. And that's kind of where we sit in the 70s.
Yeah, and like I will sound like a broken record throughout this, but like the modern capitalistic world cannot get enough oil. Like we are oil junkies. We're completely addicted. Our body's now relying on it. And in the 70s is where that addiction went from like, oh yeah, like I can quit anytime, like I promised. So like now, like we need it, and we need it fast. We need it now. We need a full on supply. And like you said, we have factories, we have power plants, and cars. Like Americans love to drive. I mean, like how much do cars mean to you guys? I know you guys love cars. And this is when Americans are commuting, and this is like that love of cars has never gone away.
Yeah, you live on the East Coast, Ekis, and I've been to Philly, and you can walk around for the most part. I don't know what the public transportation systems are like, but out here in Denver, you basically can't do your life without a car. It's not possible. Our public transportation is trying to catch up, and over the last, 20 years, we've actually seen an increase of public transit, but it's still not possible to live in this city without a car.
Yeah, and at this time in the 70s too is when things like air conditioning, right? Like some of these like modern luxuries that are in cars are starting to get input right now, and like air conditioning, all these extras and luxuries requires more energy, requires more oil, and so you have just a snowball, a true snowball effect of rapid economic expansion, cars, reliance on cars, that is adding up to a time when we are literally running out of oil.
And sounds like we got a little greedy, and we were relying on it more than we could produce. Were there whistleblowers of this at the time? Were there people being like, hey, we are like way out over our skis right now? Or was it just like drill, and keep doing what we need to do, and we'll figure it out?
There's zero forethought or look into the future for this, because you have to, we're building the American empire, like the super economic, largest economy in world history is getting built right now, and people were just searching for a way to fuel it. Like it was, and we were getting it, right? Like we had some in Texas, and now we were importing it. So as long as that supply was there and people were making buckets of money, which they were, there was zero thought put into it, and including the administration. Like we'll get into that later, but like there wasn't a single aspect of our government that was concerned with energy in the 60s or the early part of the 70s, which is actually insane.
Here's a good example for you, Rhett. This is one of my favorite, just sort of how America came to be stories. It's the General Motors streetcar conspiracy. And it's basically, it alleges that GM and I think Standard Oil and Firestone Tire had a conspiracy in the 40s, right when basically after the war, LA is starting to become the LA that we know. They're starting to build on it. But these three companies go in there and they start buying all the street cars in Los Angeles, and they start replacing them with buses that they own. And in this effort, basically at this like critical time when LA was building their infrastructure, instead of using these street cars, which now turn into subway systems, they basically scrapped it all because they just got rid of them. They made them all buses. And how do you get around on buses? The highway system. So instead of creating a New York style metro system or subway system in Los Angeles, they scrapped it and went to the highway system that we love today.
That's just insane.
I mean, isn't that feeds into the whole, I don't know if it's a theory or not, if I'm using the right word here, but the reason we're not so advanced in like rail travel and train travel and all these like efficient ways of travel that other countries are is because of oil and needing and wanting to put in the highways and like wanting to direct consumers to be able to buy this commodity that these companies are selling. I mean, feeds into that
100%. I mean, like the oil, because these Western oil companies are American oil companies, and I mean that you're talking about one of the biggest industries in the world that is protected by U.S. capitalism, and the U.S. has not and will never nationalize its oil, right? So it's always going to be run by these individual companies, and they're powerful. They have lobbyists, they have interests, they know how to swing propaganda, and 100% a big reason why we are so car dependent is from exactly what you just said, Cameron, about these people trying to push these conspiracies to keep us hooked on oil, and it works.
Yeah, I mean, modern day example, it's pretty easy to point out like China versus the United States. They do not have a capitalist society. Well, to our extent, but there's a one-party government. It's a one-party communist government. So whatever their idea of the future is what's going to happen. Here, there's so many competing forces. There's lobbyists and presidents with different aspirations and different motivations and all that. So you see us slowly falling behind where, I mean, if you've seen the electric cars coming out of China, there's a reason that the US is blocking the sales here because Tesla would be fucked. And it's just the difference of they were doing this under, a strong-armed government, but the fruits of that labor is you're starting to see a country that has a completely different reliance on oil than we do and an infrastructure that is way more electric friendly than the US will be over the next 50 years it would take us to catch up.
Yeah.
Wild.
And Rhett, you asked were there 30 whistleblowers, and there was there was an American diplomat at the time named James Plack. And he did kind of read the tea leaves, and he was quoted as saying, this is in 1970, he said that the United States and its allies, along with the oil industry, are unprepared intellectually and politically to deal with the changed balance of power in the petroleum supply. And I think what he says there, I think is dead on, and the writing was on the wall because just a few short years later, things exactly what he said would come into fruition.
Tying it back to what you were hitting on earlier of our dependence started moving to these other countries in the Middle East because we ran out here. Maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here. You're going to talk about it, but what did that agreement look like? How did that conversation start of we need to find somebody else to start getting our oil from?
Well, yeah, and it's not that we ran out, right? Because Texas still produces a ton of oil. It's just that there was a gap, right? We weren't producing enough to meet how much we were consuming, and so we had to look elsewhere to top us off, basically, to ensure that we have an endless supply. And I mean, really, it's not anything fanciful or anything. It's just basic trade deals, right? Where and those Western oil companies already had their fingers in there. I think it was more so just we're going to add more resources. We're going to put more attention into siphoning that oil out of the Middle East. And it really is we are drug addicts with it. So we're finding ways anywhere we can to get it, and the Middle East had it. And so we just simply started importing more. It was just a simple U.S. Sort of importing deal. But in 1973 is where everything does legitimately change. 1973 is one of those years where the world changed forever. And that is because that is when the first oil shock happens. And this is not this is not ancient bygone history. We are living in an oil shock right now. There was the first oil shock. We're going to talk about the second one. There's been a third one. We're living through one right now. So it's truly why this is essential history to learn. Because it's very relevant to today. But before we dive into that, Cameron, where is the U.S. culturally, politically in the 1970s right now?
Not in a good spot, Ekis. The 60s in the U.S. was just an era of crazy change, revolution, civil rights, assassination. It was all over the place. I mean, really, to get an idea of where we are in the 70s, you kind of have to start in 1968, which arguably the craziest year in U.S. history. When you want to look at historical parallels maybe to where we are today and the infighting we're seeing in our politics and the violence and really everything, there is a direct parallel to 1968. I mean, for reference, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, that is one of the biggest offensives against the United States. It totally caught us off guard. That happened in Vietnam in 1968. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. happened in 68. The assassination of RFK happened in 68. There's another shout out to our boy Sirhan Sirhan. Just kidding, you killed a great man. It was just massive changes happened in 68. And then we start seeing the changes from the JFK years, obviously assassinated in 64. Then you get the Lyndon B. Johnson years, and that is its own episode. But by the time Nixon had arrived in 69, 68, whatever in there, the world, we were sick and tired of Vietnam. We were in the throes of the Cold War. Things were not great. Oil was getting more expensive. The idea of us being able to win Vietnam, by the time we turn in 71, 72, it was This is where you get the students protesting on campus. You get those horror stories of Vietnam veterans coming home and getting spit on. Those things happened in the early 70s. This country was as politically divided as we are today, if not more so, for a whole bunch of different reasons. But really starting in the 60s, the turmoil just kept going, and Vietnam did not.
Right. And so there's the backdrop of all of this cultural and political turmoil. And while good old Nixon is in office, this is when our country's real first energy crisis hits in 1973. Nixon will be the first president to deal with that. And that's because the first oil shock is caused by the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And it is worth diving into this war because it's eerily similar to what's going on right now. The Yom Kippur War began in October of 1973. It was the fourth of the Arab-Israeli wars at the time. So just in the 25 years that Israel had existed, from 1948 to 73, they had already fought in 4 bloody wars. And this Yom Kippur War was the most destructive and intense of all of them up until probably the war that we're in right now. And this war started when Egypt and Syria, backed by an Arab coalition, launched a surprise attack on Israel. And this attack was timed deliberately for a moment of vulnerability during the holiday of Yom Kippur, which is where the war gets its name. And the choice of Yom Kippur was designed to catch Israel when they were least prepared. And it's why this attack really is so ruthless, because Israel was shut down as a country for prayer, this is their most important holiday. So for comparison, imagine if 9/11 happened on Christmas. We're talking about something that is just as psychologically devastating as it is physically. And it traumatized Israel. This was their Pearl Harbor. And it really caught them off guard. They now faced an entire Arab coalition that was legitimately hell-bent on their destruction. And so they called on their most powerful ally, which was the United States. There's so many crazy stories from this, and it just shows how being president is literally the worst job of all time, because Nixon knew that if he wanted to support Israel, it would lead to some sort of disaster in the Middle East that could potentially impact the oil supply. But he also knew that not supporting Israel meant the very real possibility of one of our key allies in the Middle East getting destroyed. There's a crazy story that on the same day, on October 11th, 1973, Nixon received 2 secret letters across his desk. The first was from Israel's Minister of Defense, which essentially it was mad scribblings that said, "Please help, we're all going to die unless you help." And the second one was from the good old 7 sisters, or 4 of them at least, of Aramco companies of Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, and Standard California. And they sent a letter to Nixon saying, if you support Israel, there's going to be a snowball effect. The U.S. is going to lose power in the region. We're going to be replaced by Russia. OPEC is going to cut off oil supply. It's going to lead to economic disaster. And so these are the 2 letters that Nixon has sitting on his desk, right? Which is one of the foremost industries of the U.S. is saying, don't do this. And one of our key allies in the Middle East, Israel, is saying, please, for the love of God, help, or we're all going to die.
Where have I heard that before? Sorry.
I mean, yeah, that sounds like the shittiest 2 notes to have on your desk ever, to try and have to make a decision out of that. I can't, yeah.
Truly.
Absolutely wild.
And so who did Nixon turn to, Ekis?
Good old Henry Kissinger.
Fucking Henry Kissinger.
Good old. Oh, we have some good Henry Kissinger quotes coming up. Just so you would.
Oh Christ.
Who's Henry Kissinger?
Oh my God, that's going to be a whole topic of its own. But he's most famously known for the Secretary of State with Nixon. But he's been around our politics since Nixon, and he's kind of like who's the Mad Money guy? Jim Cramer. Anything he says, the exact opposite happens, and millions of people, unfortunately, die. Where Jim Cramer, it's more of a money issue. With Henry Kissinger, my God, it was a lot of dead fucking civilians.
He is one of those figures that he was pulling a lot of the strings behind the scenes. I mean, he was very much in the forefront of American politics as the Secretary of State. But again, the question still rises. I'm sure there's many Americans who are like, who the hell is Henry Kissinger? But he is responsible for so many of the decisions in foreign policy maneuvers that we did, including the Yom Kippur War. Because while Nixon is debating these 2 letters, trying to figure out what to do while everything that Cameron said is going on, where the country is tearing itself apart, Henry Kissinger was a massive proponent for helping Israel. And it was from Henry Kissinger's advice and push that President Nixon did decide to help Israel. And almost immediately, the U.S. was sending massive stockpiles of munitions, supplies, warplanes, financial support. And brazenly, the U.S. was now in full support of Israel. But this wouldn't be a story from the 70s without the Soviet Union meddling in the background, because the Soviets were watching this from afar and they wanted a piece of that action. We can't forget, like Cameron was saying, that this is 1973. This is firmly in the midst of the Cold War, and the U.S. is still technically fighting in Vietnam at this point. But for those unfamiliar, Cameron, what's a quick breakdown of the Cold War and these ideologies and why this even matters?
Yeah, we're going to do a really quick breakdown of the Cold War. So that's going to be that's heavy.
You're like Kissinger, and that means it's going to be really long.
Oh God, don't ever compare me to that man. So essentially what we're looking at is the Cold War broke the world in two. And like Western powers like to think the world revolves around us, it may have started in Europe after World War II, but it basically engulfed the entire planet. Essentially under the guise that if you weren't with us, you were with the Soviets. And our foreign policy for 50 years was dictated on how do we stop the Soviets. It was known as the containment theory, but essentially we wanted to stop them any foothold that they had. So it started in Korea. That's the reason that one started, technically still going. Then it went to Vietnam. You even get the fighting in like Desert Storm, Afghanistan with the Taliban the first time. That was a whole communist versus capitalist side. So essentially what both sides did is they vilified and propagandized every part of the other side. 40 years, it was impossible for Soviets to view the Americans as people and vice versa. And it was really just this idea that, God forbid, a country aligns with the Soviets, then their neighboring country will too, and then their country will do the same thing. So it was just a stalemate that wasn't stale. Although we never directly fought the Soviets during this time, we fought all these proxy wars every decade like they were going out of style. So the world, really after World War II, the theme of it was the Cold War and what it did to the rest of the world, and oil had a lot to do with that.
Well, and this is the perfect example of the Cold War. It's called that because there was never a direct engagement between the U.S. and the Soviets, but there was a ton of conflict. I mean, constant fighting. And the Yom Kippur War was no different because the U.S. and the Soviets saw this as an opportunity for one of those proxy wars. And so the armaments on both sides of the conflict were quickly supplied by these superpowers. The United States backed Israel, and the Soviet Union backed the Arab coalition. And so we now had a full-scale regional war with the U.S. and Israel on one side, several oil-producing nations mixed in, and then the Russians meddling in the background, which sounds pretty damn familiar to what's going on today. I mean,
So
it's
not
essentially
the
the
first
same
time?
thing.
Yeah, do we dare say not the first time?
Dare we say it? So the U.S. made it clear whose side they were on with this open support for Israel, and the Arab nations saw this as an outright act of war. Like, this was essentially joining the war. They saw it as no different than an outright attack. And so the Arab coalition, more specifically OPEC, searched for a way to fight back. They wanted finally, definitively, to show the West, to show Uncle Sam that they didn't like them poking around in the Middle East, that finally this was their chance to show resolve. And this brings us to what I legitimately think is one of the most important concepts of understanding oil, and especially of modern politics in Iran and what we're in today. And that is the concept of the oil weapon. And the oil weapon is a very real sort of unofficial doctrine amongst the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations. And as we'll see, it's been used. It's a devastating effect. And it's being used right now by Iran as we're having this conversation. And the oil weapon, it works as the name suggests. You use oil to inflict damage, but more specifically, you use the flow of oil as a way to inflict economic damage on any country that's dependent on that oil. So cut off the flow of oil and you ostensibly bring any country that needs your oil to its knees. And this was openly discussed as far back as the 50s, and it was even referred to as the oil weapon. But it was honestly seen like nukes where they knew that once the cat was out of the bag, it would cause massive global damage, and there was a hesitancy to actually do it. But the Yom Kippur War brewed up that perfect storm. And once the U.S. joined, they finally felt like it was time to use oil as a weapon. And so to strike back, OPEC enacted a total oil embargo against the U.S. and its allies, which was UK, Canada, Japan. And 70% of the world's oil supply was cut off from the U.S. immediately, like at the snap of a finger. And
Wow.
Saudi Arabia alone held 25% of the world's oil reserve, which was a part of OPEC at that time. So that extra that we needed to get topped off, again, while we're still ramping up all of our economics and production domestically, is now shut off. And immediately oil prices rose almost 300%. The U.S. economy buckled because, again, we're oil junkies. Like, we now don't have supply, and we were going into withdrawals. And the leader of Saudi Arabia at the time, Faisal al-Saud, after placing the embargo, he said, "We don't want to use our oil as a weapon in a battle which only goes on for 2 or 3 days. We want to battle long enough for world opinion to be mobilized."
Fuck.
Well,
I
Jesus.
think that statement encapsulates everything that happened in 1973 and encapsulates everything that's happening in 2026. You want to use the oil weapon long enough for world opinion to mobilize.
My God.
That's crazy. Yeah, it makes sense. It's although we were at the hands of that decision, it makes sense. When you have so much control, you can cripple somebody with that, and they piss you off. What are you gonna do? I know this was the first time that you were, or at least to my understanding, that oil was used in such a way. But is there another time in history where a resource, not oil, but just a general resource, was used in a similar way, this effectively, where there cuts off of coal, where there other energy sources that people had control that they were able to cripple another economy with?
I mean, there's a lot of examples. I mean, it's any blockade or any siege. I mean, like the potato famine in Ireland was caused when the U.S. when the UK was blocking food production and grain into Ireland. So it's happened many times with resources that people need. Now, in terms of a single resource, there is of ancient sort of connection in the Bronze Age. In Bronze Age, we're talking 14, 13, 1200s BC. But the world of the Bronze Age was actually extremely globalized. You had all of these kings and nation states were very interdependent on each other through these intercomplex networks of trade. And tin was really the crude oil of the day, because you mix copper and tin to
like
make
the metal?
to make bronze.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You mix that tin with copper to make bronze, and it's called the Bronze Age because that was the major resource. It was used for tools and weapons. It was the main commodity, and the entire global network was dependent on bronze. And there is a Bronze Age collapse. Society collapses. The world goes into a dark age because that interconnected mixture of global trade networks falls apart from war, from famine. But once one of those pieces goes dark, the whole system collapses, and that causes full societal collapse. So it has happened before in history to devastating effect, where it's not just one country getting taken down, it's many.
Yeah. And not to point out, like, that's the Bronze Age history of it, but to look at our modern day, look at Cuba, what the blockade is doing to that country right now, which we will get into. But it's effectively crippled their entire infrastructure just by doing a blockade. So when you're a country that is fully run on oil and they decide to do a total oil embargo against us, it fucks shit up.
Yeah. So the dark, it just reminds me of, or it doesn't remind me, but it just brings like reason to think about just like the dark side of world trade and having partners across the world, and what the bad side of that can look like. It's pretty scary.
It's extremely fragile, and that's why conflict is the reason why these networks break down. It was major wars and revolutions. It was what caused the supply chains in the Bronze Age to collapse. It's the same thing. It's these nations that are dependent on each other. They're global networks. You need other countries. Keynesian economics is all about supply and demand and importing what you don't produce. And all of that is dependent on cooperation. And so when you have these conflicts, it just only messes up the system and causes devastation.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it last week. The reason that Japan hit Pearl Harbor is because the U.S. cut off Japan from global trade. We didn't like what they were doing in China, so we cut them off, and their reaction to that was fucking bomb Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. What about the flip side of this, right? OPEC cuts US off. We go into an oil crisis. Obviously, super bad for us. And I have a question of just about what it was like during that time. But what sort of negative effects did it have on them? Because there's no way this is just a one-sided thing.
We're gonna get into it, and not to get like too far ahead of it, but these are countries ran by dictators, and they were flooded with cash, and that cash was misappropriated. Like they were not using that cash to reinvest into their country or to rearm or build a military. It was all it was literally blown away. They had all that cash and they spent it on mansions and on making
Have you
themselves
seen
like the Saudi
Saddam's
princes.
palace, dude? Fuck, that thing slapped.
Exactly. It went in. It fed straight into that royal, again, like the Saudi princes, and so the money. The money was not you like your average citizen of a Gulf country at the time didn't see a dime of that money. It all went to the powerful and the elite, and that was a big. We're going to get into it, but that was a big part in the Iranian Revolution. Was that very question of, we're getting all this money, why is it not benefiting me?
Yeah. And last question I have just on this little piece here is, you mentioned obviously crisis in the United States for this first oil shock in 1973. We can compare it to living in oil shock now, like you mentioned earlier, but what was the difference? What was it like in 73? Cameron, you might be able to speak to this pretty well because you gave us the rundown earlier, but what were some differences on what that felt like then versus what it feels like today?
Ikis is going to get into this in just a second. The differences. I mean, basically what happens in 73 and is the end result of what might happen now. So not to be, the bearer of bad news on that. But what Ikis is about to describe in terms of what the environment was in the U.S. is foreshadowing a little bit of the possibility of what could happen here.
Yes, and that's because while the Yom Kippur War only lasted 2 weeks, which is relatively short, it does end, relatively quickly. The total oil embargo that was placed on the U.S. was inactive, or remained active for 6 months, and the consequences of that stretched along into 1974 and beyond. And the most famous of those consequences was the gas lines. The gas lines are one of those notorious things of American history, especially going into Nixon and Carter administration. And the gas lines they're insane to think about today. Like, they generally are. And that's because the gas stations in the U.S. were literally running dry without any more gas on the way. Prices soared. And there were lines of cars that stretched around city blocks. Some of them stretched for 6 miles of people just waiting to go into a gas station and fill up their tanks because everyone thought that there wouldn't be any left. It caused a panic. And as we've mentioned many times before this, we're car dependent. We're relying on cars. People commute. Your car in a lot of ways is your livelihood. It's how you get to work. And so people were panicking. And again, this is when suburbs were rapidly expanding. This was a massive problem, to the point that Nixon had to shift his entire administration to figure out how to claw out of this. And some of the things that happened from this are, again, insane. Like, gas was straight up rationed in some places. Nixon had the lights turned off in Times Square to conserve energy. He gave a national address where he told people to go cold in the winter. Basically, he was basically like, don't use your heat, wear a coat, just deal with it. He even told some U.S. companies to stop working, to shut down operations if it meant they could conserve energy. And he even toyed with the idea of a full-on invasion of the Middle East. Like, it became such a big problem that he was like, maybe we just send in our GIs and take over the Middle East, which is a little bit of political and historical foreshadowing there. He was a little ahead of his time on that one.
Yeah, we're just finishing
these impacts
dream
were
now. Fuck.
Yeah, I know, seriously.
Fever dream.
And car sales were impacted, especially the big, large gas guzzlers that were starting to become popular. They stopped selling, and speed limits became common across the U.S. It's because of the first oil shock that speed limits were federally enacted across the country in the 1974 Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act. And those early speed limits were limited to 55 miles an hour. And none of that was because of safety. It wasn't for safety at all. It was to conserve our insatiable thirst of oil.
That's wild.
That is wild.
And some places even placed restrictions on weekend driving. They outright banned driving on the weekends, which again, just imagine today if for the comparison today, right, like you were asking, like just imagine if Biden had gone out there and said no one's allowed to drive on weekends. We would lose our collective minds because we are so used to having that unlimited source of energy that it would break our brains, and it broke their brains, honestly. And like Cameron was saying, we are not too far away if things continue how they're going from seeing shocks like this again. Because the oil embargo lasted 6 months, and now we're currently 2 months in the Strait of Hormuz being closed, so we have a ways to go, but damage has already been done.
Look at how much people lost their minds when we asked them to put a piece of cloth over their mouth.
They're still bitching about it.
Exactly.
Can you imagine telling them not to go drive somewhere?
It's going to happen.
Shit.
Like we saw the pushback with masks, and now if we have to tell people to start rationing gas, we're now even more dependent on cars than we were in the 1970s. We're not prepared, and people in 1973 were not prepared. There was a large part of the American public that didn't even know that America was importing oil at all. There was a complete lack of understanding that the U.S. was now dependent on Middle Eastern oil in the 1970s, and it broke people's brains. Like these gas lines were deeply unsettling because this is 1973. The U.S. is booming, right? We're rapidly expanding, and now that we're running out of gas, which is fueling our country, it broke people's perception of what the U.S. was and what our foreign policy was.
Well, I want to try and relate this to this current spot that you're talking about here. So just tell me if this is something that we need to hit on later. At the time that this went into effect, were we measuring like price per barrel during the trading here, and what was the price per barrel hitting? Because a lot of the rhetoric that I'm hearing related to today is that if we hit 150 a barrel, we are going to go into world economic collapse. And I imagine that there has to be some correlation there at the time to where it was just getting too expensive, or was it strictly like, hey, a reduction of supply? Does that make sense what I'm getting at here? Like, was it a reliance on like, hey, this is getting too expensive and we can't afford it, the people can't afford it, we can't get enough in here, we're not going to pay that money? Or was it straight up like supply shock?
It was both. I mean, with those Western companies being so involved in the Middle East, we were always concerned about the price of oil and how much these companies were making. So it was both. And actually, this is when the oil companies become true villains within the American public, because with a cutoff in supply, they're now charging higher prices, and they're getting filthy rich. The oil companies made so much money from the total oil embargo of 1973. So while they were lining their pockets with cash, you're waiting in a 6-mile long gas line to fill up your car. And so it's not only is it more expensive on your end as a consumer, but there's not enough of it. And then these companies that are supplying it are getting filthy rich. So it was both. And they've always been very concerned with the prices of things because there's people making a lot of money from it.
It leads me to just think like, are we dependent on oil, or are we just dependent on cheap oil?
We are dependent on cheap oil, and we're definitely going to get into that when we get into the 2010s and how we fracking and all of that, because that plays a huge part in how the U.S. handles oil production today, because we are the number one producer of oil in the world. It's the U.S. No country produces more oil than the U.S., but we still import buckets of it because we're going to get into it, but we can't use the oil that we have. In short, we're going to definitely get into that. But we are drug addicts, so we want a cheap supply of our drug, and we get it wherever we can find it.
Well, and I think during this time, too, you're starting to see the emergence of not only is it like a resource that we need, but because it's has weaved itself into the fabric of life. So it's not like, even if the U.S. could outproduce everything, if one day we just decided to stop trading for oil, the Middle East would fall apart. And like the world economy would fall apart. And the longer this goes and the further into the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s that we get into, the more it's weaved into it. So it doesn't just become like, oh, we can get our oil from here, go fuck yourself, other country. It's like, no, because if we stop doing that, that country collapses. It becomes that dire of a resource for these people that any change in it, any fuck up, any holding it back, anything fucks up everything.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about cars, which obviously is central to this. But in the 70s, this is when we see plastics becoming common. Like we're now seeing so many other products that are now using petroleum. Like sunscreen is made from petroleum. Like you can find lists online of how many products are made from petroleum, and it's genuinely shocking to see how many of these products are made from petroleum. And this is all ramping up in the 70s. So just like Cameron said, we're starting to weave in petroleum into almost every consumer product of our daily lives.
Yeah, so much so that all of us have microplastics in our balls. Like, that's oil, baby.
I was thinking that same thing.
Oil,
man.
baby.
Thanks 70s.
There's no
Oh,
Dove
my God.
hand soap for that kind of fucking oil disaster.
Truly. And so again, like the total oil embargo of 1973, it is one of those dates that I think should be talked about more, especially within American history. 1973 brought in a new era for the world and even for the people that were in charge, and that includes Nixon and Kissinger, because before that point, no one really appreciated how important oil was. Until it started to hit American consumers from this embargo. And in classic American fashion, it took us to have our backs against the wall to even acknowledge that we had a problem. I mean, like how many problems have we had, Cameron, as a country that we continue to kick down the road? Like how many times could we have solved the slavery problem and just continually kicked it down the road? It's the same thing with oil.
Thanks, Andrew Johnson. Yeah, it's become just madness across the entire region. The reason that we trade with all these people, the reason that it's become so important, we've used it everywhere. And in the 70s, the U.S. was fucking tired. Vietnam ends in 75, right, Ecos? So we are like damn near close to the end of it. There's a war that started in 68 or 67 or something. So, like, Americans at this point were tired of the war, tired of being told all of this, that we're winning, and yet we're still there. And then we come to the gas station, we can't fill up our own car. And so the U.S., the pressure on our politicians and just the overall feeling in this country, to say the least, was just not good.
Yeah, and Henry Kissinger, at the time, even acknowledged oil. After the Yom Kippur War, the gas lines happened. Henry Kissinger would refer to oil as a weapon of political blackmail. And again, I think
God, I
that
hate that
perfectly
fucking guy.
sums up.
Fucking Kissinger.
Perfectly sums up what oil has become on the political scene. It is a weapon of political blackmail. And it's from this embargo that the U.S. switched its entire foreign policy to focus on controlling the flow of oil in the Middle East. It's why we have 20 military bases spread out through the Middle East right now. It's why, as we'll get into later, we fought 2 separate wars with Saddam Hussein for no other reason than oil. And Dan Yergin, in his book The Prize, which I highly recommend to anyone, that was used as our main source for this. But in The Prize, he said that oil had become the main focus of presidents and premiers, of foreign and finance and energy ministers, of congressmen and parliaments, of regulators and czars, of activists and pundits, and in particular of Henry Kissinger, who by his own proud admission had before 1973 known nothing about oil and precious little about international economics, which is just exactly what you want to hear about your Secretary of State.
I think Cameron needs a Kissinger t-shirt. That might be a good.
You get
a
that
good
at
gift for
Burns.
you.
But guess what? That old bitch is dead now. Fuck you, Harry.
Oh my God!
All right, you're getting a
Good
shirt.
old Henry Kissinger.
So Andrew, you've hit a little bit on this, and I think I know the answer, but it still begs the question. As we saw our dependence on oil continuing to grow throughout the 70s and using it, like, why were we so unprepared for getting cut off, or not getting cut off, but like the shortage and this embargo. How did that catch us by surprise?
Well, again, Americans, in my opinion, are notorious for ignoring problems until it really blows up in our face and we have to deal with it. And so we're not a very forward-looking country. We're not like we're very much of the time and of the present of who's benefiting right now. So I think there was a short-sightedness just baked into how the U.S. government typically works. And also, I think the fact that we do have states like Texas that do produce so much oil gives us the blinders a little bit. Because again, we're not completely dry like Japan. Like we do have massive amounts of oil that we produce. So I think that it's a little bit of smoke and mirrors because we do produce a ton of oil. We're still the number one oil producing country, but we just use so much of it that we're constantly searching for more, and we're finding it. That's something that happens all the time, is that we start to find it in Alaska, right? Like just out of the blue, some miner somewhere hits a rock and it starts spurting oil, and now we have a new massive ocean of oil that we can draw on. So there's these constant moments where we're finding more oil, and so we feel more sure about it, but it's a short-sightedness. Really, it really is just an inability to plan long term, and energy again at this point was never thought of. We could have such an energy utopia again if we've got into like renewable energies and nuclear energy, but it's the companies, it's capitalism, it's the fact that it's baked in to cars and our economy and products, and we just need more oil so that people that are making money can make money.
Fair. Cameron, hot takes?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's yes. Yep, I agree with you, Gus. Fuck.
I'll take it. I'll take that. And so the oil embargo would be lifted. It did eventually end after 6 months, but that oil weapon was a reality now. It's real, and again, it's being used right now. And the world has really been waiting in fear constantly for when it would be used the next time, which is again why this, if there was any amount of history that people would actually learn in government, they would have studied that the oil weapon had been used before, and maybe don't attack Iran, who can use the oil weapon. But again, I digress, because what the oil weapon did was make OPEC extremely powerful, right? We had said that they had trouble coordinating, they had trouble getting things up and running, they weren't making a lot of money, but using that oil weapon showed how much bargaining power that they actually had. It made them extremely, extremely powerful. And it's when the oil-producing countries in the Middle East really rose to prominence in the 70s. Because again, that oil weapon, the way that they used it, how much bargaining power it gave them, they now did as intended from OPEC. They controlled the majority of the global oil supply. They influenced prices, and they now have the power to reshape global economies. And Yarvin, again, in his book, The Prize, notes that those who seemed to control oil prices were regarded as the new masters of the global economy. Those masters were OPEC. And OPEC ran the global oil market as a sort of cartel for the rest of the 70s, and they still kind of do, basically.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia fucking tried to buy the PGA Tour. Like, oil goes a long way. Oil money is crazy money.
Trying to buy golf.
They just tried to buy golf and F1 racing and sports leagues. Like, oil money. That's good money. If you can get it.
It's good money. And this is when nation states start to gobble up the oil companies. Like, this is when there is that for however messy that 50-50 split that they tried to have between the oil companies and the oil countries, at this time is when we see true nationalization. An example of that is Saudi Aramco, which today is the world's most profitable company. They are even more profitable than Apple or Microsoft. And Saudi Aramco started as one of those concession agreements between the Saudi Arabian government and Standard Oil Company of California. But the government slowly started to purchase more of it, especially when they had the bargaining power from the oil weapon. They had 25% interest in 1973, but by 1980, they had 100% of the company, which is, again, why it's the most profitable company in the world is a Saudi company in the Middle East that is selling oil.
And to be honest,
Saudi
if we could have just
Aramco.
started there and let them have their oil to begin with, it may have saved us a lot of bloodshed.
Could have started there.
100%.
Saudi Aramco's revenue in 2024 was $480.4 billion with a B.
What the fuck?
It's absurd. I mean, it truly is absurd. So as the Middle East's grip on oil production tightened, the U.S. oil reserve continued to fall. So this, again, we were finding new reserves, but our production is just always outpacing how much we can actually produce domestically. But in 1977, we get a new president. This is when we elect Jimmy Carter as the 39th president of the United States. Jimmy Carter, very famously, has humble origins. Before his career in politics, he was a naval officer. He served aboard a submarine, and then he left active duty to return home and work on his family's peanut farm, which is just so charming. And he did run on a human rights ticket, which I just imagine that. Imagine someone running on a human rights ticket today. Like, it's just sad how far we've fallen a little bit. He did defeat Gerald R. Ford as a dark horse candidate. And when he stepped into office, he was really looking to clean things up. The nation was still stewing on the Watergate scandal for everything that Nixon did. And there really was sort of an anti-corruption ticket and policy that he wanted to run. And he did immediately see the energy problem. This is a presidency that is, for the first time, completely from beginning to end wrapped up in energy. While Nixon had to deal with it, in the latter half of his presidency, the entire presidency of Jimmy Carter is concerned with energy and oil. And he really is a victim of a century's worth of history that's kind of culminated. He really was. He became president at a pretty inopportune time for dealing with the energy crisis. Because everything that we've been talking about comes to a climax while he's president.
Cameron, I saw you shaking your head there.
I can't hold back my love for goddamn Jimmy Carter. Not necessarily because of the things he did, but I swear to God, he's the only president we've had who's not a complete and total fucking psychopath or sociopath, whichever one fits. Jimmy Carter got railroaded. He got fucked. He's got a bad rep through history. And as I've mentioned on this podcast before, we are a firmly pro Jimmy Carter podcast. So let me just get that out of the way, goddammit. The besmirchment of Jimmy Carter is just shameful. But he was only there for 4 years, and he got fucked at the end of it too. But really what Jimmy Carter tried to do was be the American president that was a normal American. There wasn't necessarily these different aspects of Jimmy Carter that you get confused by. He, for all intents and purposes, seems like a pretty straightforward guy, and was a pretty straight shooter. Seemed like a genuinely good person. Obviously, he's a politician, so probably not. But, you know, for his 4 years there, he got fucked by oil. He got fucked by Reagan. I mean, he did pass the Camp David Accords, which is still a monumental part of history. That's what the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel at the time. Obviously, when Nika's talking about the Yom Kippur War, that's the Arab coalition going against Israel. This was like the first time there was a peace agreement, and that's Jimmy fucking Carter, baby. The Panama Canal, he did that as well. That's actually, this is probably one of the reasons that some Americans don't like him, but he's responsible for basically giving back the Panama Canal to Panama to kind of resurrect our relations in South America at the time and Latin America. So he did a bunch of that. He was really human rights focused, like Ika's talked about, and he was the first president to normalize China's relations with us. So he recognized the People's Republic of China and strengthened our diplomatic ties. So there are things that Jimmy Carter did that still live on, but Jimmy Carter got fucked by Ronald Reagan. Big old dildo style, fucked by Ronald Reagan.
He did, yeah. Well, and he is usually dumped on. Like, people, you talk to any of like the history bros, you see the lists online that rank presidents. Jimmy Carter's always dumped on. But I think it is a little unfair, especially considering what he went through, and the situation that he was handed. And he had his blunders for sure. Like, we're gonna get into it. Like, it ended as a mess.
You know,
who's perfect? But he was just too good of a person to be he's regarded as a lower tier president, but he's widely regarded as the best ex-president, as like the president that did the most good after office, because he was like 100 years old, still building houses for Habitat for Humanity. He would travel around the world. Like, he really did do a lot of good in the world post-presidency.
Damn straight.
And credit is due where credit is deserved, though, especially when it comes to energy, because for all of those things that we've said about Carter, he did push for a reduced dependence on foreign oil. He pushed for a market-based pricing strategy, a national energy strategy, and he even created the Department of Energy and Education as a way to curtail this energy problem that he now inherited. So Jimmy, he was trying, like he was legitimately trying. Again, I think the creation of the Department of Energy as a new cabinet position, within the presidency is a massive step and a sign of just how important oil and energy now was, where this is a new cabinet position. So he could claim a series of important accomplishments, but it wasn't enough because OPEC continued to dominate the world oil market. They still accounted for 60% of total oil production. And Carter even wrote in his personal memoir that the greatest nation on earth was being jerked around by a few desert states. That's how he saw it. That's how it was. It's really how it still is. Soon after Carter wrote that, the greatest nation on earth was being outmaneuvered by the Middle East, a new second major oil shock would hit. So not only was OPEC rising in power, but there was about to be a second oil shock, and that was because of the Iranian Revolution, which we've gone in. I think we've touched on this in every single one of our episodes at this point. But this was one of the largest oil exporters that collapsed into chaos. The Shah, who was America's key ally, was overthrown and replaced with a theocratic Islamic regime that deemed the West and all of America its greatest ally, or its greatest enemy. And this was big because Iran was a Fulcrum country. It was essential to the stability of the region, essential to the security of the world's oil supplies. It was one of the world's largest exporters of oil, and it was a regional power. And it's bizarre, and it goes back to what you were asking about earlier, Rhett, about what is the positive side of this oil weapon getting used. Well, a major contributing factor of the Iranian Revolution was the insane amount of cash that Iran was getting once the oil weapon was used, once they had this bargaining power, once OPEC was actually coming together and setting, controlling prices. Iran was making, honestly, too much money. Like it was making so much money that it couldn't absorb it into its political and economic system, and he wasted all of it. Like he literally wasted all of it. It was going to his regime, his dictatorship. The average Iranian didn't see a dime of it, and so it is one of those classic examples of the elites getting filthy rich while the populace as a whole is going hungry. This led to economic chaos, social and political tension, and it ultimately is what led to the revolution in the current regime, was the fact that they had resources that they were squandering and not giving to their populace. After the Iranian Revolution, oil supply dropped again, prices surged, panic returned, because you now have one of the major sources of the world's oil is shut off again, and the gas lines return with a vengeance just in time for poor old Jimmy Carter. And these gas lines were even worse than the ones in 1973 because people remembered, right? Like this was recent history, so the memory of how disastrous these gas lines were still in people's heads, and so they were worse. And to make matters worse, this is insane, but a typical car at the time used 0.7 of a gallon an hour idling in these gas lines. So it's suggested that American motorists in 1979 wasted 150,000 barrels of oil a day just by idling in these gas lines.
Turn off your car.
Jesus Christ, what a fucking, my God.
So it's
That's crazy.
the perfect microcosm of us just self-perpetuating our own energy crisis.
I know Carter gets a lot of flack. If the first crisis taught us a lesson, like how did this hit again so soon after? How do we allow this to become a crisis again immediately?
The power didn't change. The embargo was lifted in 73, but nothing changed there. The same countries were still controlling it. And after the Shah gets removed in 79 in Iran, basically the U.S., the person we were rubbing shoulders with, the guy that we were doing all the deals with, the Shah, was gone. So now they were adding another adversary in the area. This is when the Soviets were in Afghanistan fighting that war is in 79. So it's like all these other geopolitical things happened, but the root causes of the oil embargo in 73, they hadn't been fixed either. So it's just getting worse.
Yeah, and it's the last administration's problem falling on whatever the current administration is. Because, I mean, we're only talking a few years after the Yom Kippur War. It's just, he was sunk from the beginning. truly. Like there was just no way he was going to be able to claw out of it. And it literally sank his presidency. Like he lasted one term because of the second oil shock. Like the country just cannot stand for that. Second oil shock hits, you're going to blame the top dog. That was Jimmy Carter. And then, of course, things were made worse when you had the Iranian hostage situation, which is a massive blunder in his own right, which, again, we talked about the conspiracy with Reagan
Fuck you,
there.
Reagan.
But those two things combined, you're right, the second gas line in this Iranian hostage situation, and he was sunk. There was just nothing he could do. So what do we think so far? Because I feel, and this goes back to your question, Rhett, that like I can confidently say that the situation that we're in today in Iran, which is just as dire, if not more, than what the embargo was in '73, is unfolding because the people in power today either are one, ignoring history, not learning it, or they're just straight out choosing to ignore that history, because it's clear from the history that we've learned today that oil is used as a weapon. Kissinger himself said that it's political blackmail. This is not far gone history. This happened in 1973, and we're falling into the same trap.
I mean, I got a take, but Cameron, I'd love for you to crack at this first.
This subject is perfect because this is literally why we started this conversation, because we wanted to kind of link Ekis and I's passion of history with what the fuck is going on today. And there's literally not a better example than this story, than talking about oil. We haven't made the switch as a country to a new sustainable source of energy. So this is still the lifeblood of this country. This hasn't changed. And we started this series in 1901, and now we're in the 80s, and we're still having the same conversation. And as you guys have probably been able to pick up during this, what Ekis is talking about today is talking about in this timeline is exactly what's happening today. So it couldn't be more relevant, yet seem more distant, yet be more impactful. It's just such a wild case study of history in one subject that it's fun that we're talking about it, but goddamn, is it dark?
Well, it's the importance of not forgetting. I mean, we have genuinely forgotten those two oil shocks. We've forgotten the gas lines, and for the current administration to say that they never, it was a shock to them that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz and use the oil weapon, is unacceptable. Again, they either don't know the history or they're choosing to ignore it, because we just laid out a good hour of this exact scenario falling into place, and we're right back in it. It's so eerily similar.
Yeah, I mean, I truly think it's the latter. They don't care. And if they do, they don't have people in their cabinet that care or are sharing this information or telling them about it. But I wasn't born yesterday. Trump lived through this shit. But do you think that ever, affected him the way that it affected any other American? My guess would be no. And I saw this, I think, I don't know it wasn't a press briefing, but they were questioning Hegseth the other day. You guys probably are more in tune with what that actually was or what the conversation was there. But it was mentioned in there of like, did we actually realize how much money that this war was going to cost and what it's going to put on the average American person? It's predicted that this year will cost the average American $5,000 more to survive and to live. And the majority of the population will feel that. And the people that won't feel that are the people that are making the decisions. And I just think it's twisted. I know Trump had a comment super early on saying something like, if I had it my way, I'd just go in there and take all the oil. Like,
Yeah,
I
his
mean,
Venezuela approach. Like,
yeah. Reading through the lines, for us, diving into this and seeing this, like, we're starting to get this, Ekis, as you mentioned last time, like this hidden secret history of these wars is what we're talking about. But Jesus Christ, it's just that they're playing all of us for fools, and they don't care how tough it is on us. They don't care if we have to wait in line to get oil. They don't care if we have to cut back. If my energy bill is 40% more this month than it was this time last year, they don't give a shit about any of that. They're making more money and they don't care.
They don't. And I think that, the perfect example to very relevant politics right now is this stupid fucking ballroom. It's like, I'm spending so much more money on my energy, and Lindsey Graham is talking about how Americans need to foot the bill for $400 million ballroom. And I'm like, dude, read the fucking room. No, I don't think the gilded president himself will feel the effects of this. They can still buy their fake gold off of a fucking IKEA or whatever and put it in the Oval Office. That's not going to affect them. It affects us, and it's going to affect his kids. Like, Donnie Jr. and them still have to live in this world. Barron Trump still has to grow up in this. It's the lack of like foresight here is appalling. And I think a lot of Americans are frustrated with the situation because it feels very haphazard that we are getting into this story again as a country based on what? The war aims changed from the day this started to Marco Rubio admitting that it was because Israel said they were about to strike. And then it became about the Strait of Hormuz itself and blockading that and making sure that that was the thing. I mean, I think the moving goalpost, the constantly changing war aims, and being told that, suck it up. Like, you're fine. You can suck it up at the gas station and then pay for my fucking ballroom. And it's like, dude, sell that Qatari jet you got and build your own fucking ballroom.
There we go. I love it.
Well, he should be concerned, though, because as we learned, the oil weapon has the power to sink a presidency. It took down Jimmy Carter. And so for everything that Trump has against him and that he's done and for everything that he's been able to get away with, again, once you genuinely impact every single U.S. consumer and we're told to ration, it could be his defining legacy is going into putting the U.S. into another energy crisis and oil shock.
Yeah. I think what I'm particularly interested to see, and I don't want to see this at the cost of our average American fellow out there. I want all of us to be okay and be good, but everybody just got a tax refund. And so spending in March is not something that is really of concern to people. Well, most people, I should say. We typically see elevated spending this time of year in March and April. And I am nervous for that other shoe to drop. And when that money starts drying up, the people that rely on a tax refund to have additional spending money, how quickly that goes away, where this is going to start to lead, because I see a pretty gloomy next couple months due to the continual rise in energy costs here.
Months? Buddy.
I hope.
We're talking.
I hope,
we're
my
going
man.
through the history of this. I don't know where months comes in. Years.
I'm being hopeful. All right.
The Soviets were stuck in Afghanistan for like 8 years and accomplished fucking nothing. We were stuck in Afghanistan for 20 years and accomplished fucking nothing. Like, do you notice how the president, he keeps talking about how long we were in Vietnam and how long we were in World War I and how long we were in World War II. It's almost like he's preparing us to be like, hey, at least it was shorter than Vietnam. It's like, buddy, are you telling us this is about to be another Vietnam? Like, this isn't, the timeline here is getting longer and longer. It's not like things are not going well. I don't know who's like gaslighting the president to think that like these negotiations are going well or whatever, or that blocking the Strait of Hormuz is somehow like a good thing. The advice that the president of the United States is getting has got to be the worst advice I've ever fucking heard. This is crazy.
Yeah, but like, the Strait of Hormuz, we're only getting like, what, 10% of U.S. oil through there?
If that.
I know
don't
it
even
affects...
think we get that much. But
yeah, so...
all of our allies do, and Japan does.
Yeah.
Well, and again, like, currently we are the largest producer of oil as any other nation. But again, we need that top off. Like you say, only like 10 or something percent, but that's a massive 10%. I mean, imagine if you lost 10% of your blood supply, right? Like your body goes through shocks. Like, it seems like a small percentage in the grand scheme of things, but it is so essential to how our country operates, because we cannot have a deficit of oil. We get gas lines, things shut down, there's oil shocks, entire companies are shutting down. We're going to have him coming up on the podium again saying for companies to stop working. Like it causes such a massive crisis that we need every drop that we can get. And so, and again, it's the blinders, right? Because we now with fracking, which we're going to get into, we are producing ton of oil, but it does still matter. Like the Strait of Hormuz closing still matters. And back to that quote of using the oil weapon until public opinion mobilizes, there is so much pressure on the U.S. to solve this because countries like Japan that are completely dependent on it, the UK, like the rest of the world needs that oil, and when the rest of the world is putting pressure on you to open it, it has a reverberating effect.
I have some questions on. I know that this we're gonna get into more of it. I think that that's kind of the cliffhanger here, that maybe we're tiptoeing around a little bit of not wanting to go too much here. But I think a big question for a future episode for me is, if we are producing so much, how are we still so reliant on this issue that's going on right now, and why is it affecting us at the pump so much, and why is it affecting our just overall energy cost, and why are we getting absolutely screwed for dare I say, like, egotistical war and excursion, as we properly named it in our first episode? Like, why is this hurting us so much? Because it's not good, and it's upsetting.
Ooh, we're gonna get into it. I wish we could get into it now. Things get even crazier in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, but it is gonna have to be for part 3 because fracking in and of itself completely changed the oil landscape in the world and the U.S. economy. And fracking only happens in the U.S. It's the only place in the world that gets oil through fracking, and it has completely dominated. The reason why we are the #1 producer of oil in the world is fracking. Because again, our rigs in Texas and Oklahoma, New Mexico have been slowly running dry. But when fracking came into play, it changed everything, and it was cheap oil. It immediately became a massive stash of our drug addicts supply that we could use whenever we want. But we can't use it. And that's going to be the cliffhanger for next. Like, we have, and we're producing all this oil, but we ourselves cannot use any of it. And it makes such a fascinating situation.
Absolutely.
Mind-blowing.
That is a great cliffhanger for next week. Because as much as we wanted to fit this all into 2 episodes, as much as we wanted to fit this all into 1 episode, what a crazy idea that was, boys.
I know.
Yeah, we're going to have to push this to 3 because the next part is where shit gets real. And this is going to be a lot of history that people still know and still like remember. So that's going to make it even more infuriating.
Love it. All right, we feel like we're at a good spot to cut the oil talk for today.
I think so. That was a good one.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, great job, man.
Thank you.
Before we get to our call outs here, we got to keep the trend going. What is still good in the world, my dudes?
For me, it's running into some snags right now. But I think the news of InfoWars and Alex Jones getting bought out by The Onion is corporate
Incredible.
use being used for like actual justice, because it is finally going to become the parody that it always has been. And for people that don't know, InfoWars was run by Alex Jones, who's a performative political commentator that has caused so much widespread conspiracy propaganda and just hate and just misinformation around the world for so long. For like 20 years he's been on the radio, probably even longer than that. And so the fact that The Onion, which is a parody account, bought it, I think is just so great. And I know that some of the proceeds from that sale, they went to the families of Sandy Hook, which I again also think is great because they were the ones that were most affected from Alex Jones.
Yeah, the Onion CEO went out of his way to make sure that all the Sandy Hook families were cool with it. But his theory was like, I want to give, because Alex Jones, I believe, owes over $1 billion throughout all the lawsuits against him.
He's sunk.
He's such a fucking piece of shit. But that's, whatever, besides the point. But basically, he's like, I want to give these families actual money. And he's like, with the ideas that he has for The Onion, it sounds like it's going to be incredible. They've got like comedy writers coming in. He didn't quite go through what they're like have in store, but he's like, yo, keep an eye out because it's going to be fun. So that is a great story, Ikas. What a good use of Alex Jones's piece of shit website.
It's a form of justice in a weird, twisted, American only way, but it's happening.
Good for the owner of The Onion, man. Holy shit. Like, Good on that guy.
Truly.
Cameron, what do you got? What's so good in the world, my man?
I mean, mine's not great. I have been stewing on this goddamn passport thing for the 2 days now that I've known that the president wants to put his fucking face on passports. Could you imagine giving it to a customs agent in Berlin with Donald Trump's fucking face on it? Crazy. Can't even do it. But it did remind me of something that is awesome about Americans. And earlier in the year, Donald Trump put his face on the Parks Service, or the Parks badge, the annual Parks badge, which normally has eagles or canyons or rivers or whatever. But Donnie, being the interminable narcissist, put himself on it this year. But I do want to give a shout out to all the Etsy creators who created sleeves, stickers, wallets, all these different things that basically fit the card perfectly and make sure that Donald Trump's face can't be put on all of the things that we hold dear. So my good thing for the week is the American people. Although we're still going through it, there are still some funny motherfuckers out there and people who are still putting up the good fight. So shout out to all of you guys. Shout out to you too, gents. I fucking love doing this with you guys. It's great to talk about how fucked everything is, but ultimately what makes this country great is the people, and you two are some of the better ones. So appreciate it.
Man, there we go.
You as well, my man.
Yeah.
A little bit of resiliency goes a long way these days.
It does. I truly believe, our hearts are in a really good spot doing this and trying to tie things back for those that don't know everything or don't have the time to spend diving into this like you guys have been doing, and really just putting this information front and center at such a time. It's great. So back at you, Cam. I'm gonna keep it local again this week for mine, and it's something that is really closely related to just an extreme passion of mine, which is fly fishing in the great American outdoors. So Colorado Parks and Wildlife just celebrated the opening of a new state wildlife area. It's called the Collard Ranch. And it's going to be open to hunting and angling in late August. And so this is a new, about 1,800 acre property that was acquired by Colorado Parks and Wildlife back in March of 2024. And it's in the South Park Valley. For those that aren't familiar with Colorado, you are probably familiar with the show South Park. This is not the same area. South Park was actually based on high school that our boy Cameron went to over here. Funny side story, but we might get to another
Different
time.
day. Yep.
Different day. But the South Park Valley sits, just beyond the Front Range in Colorado here. And it's just this beautiful, abundant place with wildlife and meandering streams, and it's beautiful, and sports people absolutely love it. And so I've been driving by this ranch on my way to go do those things all my life, and I've always looked at it and been like, God, that looks awesome. I just want to fish that creek. And I can finally do it. And what I think is the coolest part about this is the reason I can finally go fish that creek is because every year that myself and other Coloradoans and other tourists coming here buy a hunting and fishing license, there's a $12.15 habitat stamp that is required that you have to pay for. And so the $2 million purchase of this ranch was funded through the sale of that stamp. And so it was really cool to see the money I've been paying into this for all my life is going to something I can go use. And that was enacted back in 2006, and it's helped secure public access in hunting and fishing for thousands and thousands of acres. It's granted access to 146,000 acres of land for hunting and fishing and 316,000 acres for fish and wildlife habitat in Colorado. Sick. And so proud of my government here, proud of a state program, proud of parks and wildlife in these state wildlife areas that we're putting into really good use here. So that's my good news for the week. Super stoked to go hit that up when it finally opens up here.
I hadn't heard that, Rhett, but that is awesome. And any news about us creating national parks as opposed to selling them off is good news in my book.
Yes,
agreed. Love that.
It's what the American West is all about, man. The great outdoors. So cool, fellas. We feel like we're at a good spot to end for this week.
I think so, boys. I think we got through the 70s.
And there's more to come.
More to come. All right, boys. Well, we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.